Owen, we're here today to talk about Skyfall. This is Daniel Craig's third outing as Bond, James Bond. And to me, this is about the darkest James Bond movie that I have ever seen. And also, for me, one of the best. I don't yet know what you think of it, but we'll get there. What I love about this movie is that it is saying goodbye to an old era. It is saying that the enemy can push buttons now and can do evil just with the touch of a computer. It's a young man's game, and James Bond is getting old. Of course, he doesn't look old. He still looks great. But I think that there is a sort of farewell to the past and hello to the future that's embedded in this story that I quite love, as well as one of the great villains, Javier Bardem, who plays a former agent who has all kinds of revenge up his sleeve. And the darkness of this movie, mixed in with fantastic flights of racing around and all the things that we expect of James Bond, for me, really worked surprisingly well.
Well, Lisa, I wish I could agree with you. I mean, listen, I'm all in favor of a dark and emotionally complicated James Bond movie. I'm a Daniel Craig believer. I'm a believer in Casino Royale, which I thought was one of the 10 best movies of the decade.
That's right.
But I thought that the whole is James Bond too old and out of date thing in this movie seemed like something that they brought out of mothballs from other movies like the Indiana Jones films. And the problem I had with it is that I don't actually think it applies. This whole idea that the villains now are these rogue terrorists. We're in the post 9/11 world, the world of Al-Qaeda, the world where you can do stuff through computers, you can destroy things with a button. Well, I've seen that before, but also, wouldn't that be a world that would need James Bond more than ever? Why would James Bond be irrelevant in that world? I didn't think that they had thought that through.
It's a James Bond who needs to adapt, and one of the things that I found
Why does he need to adapt?
Because the James Bond that we know was not a guy who dealt with this kind of thing. And in fact, one of the things that I love about the beginning of this movie, which just gives nothing away, is that Bond himself goes through a sort of self-reflective period to decide whether he really still wants to play all of this stuff. And the combination of his self-absorption and reflection, and Judi Dench trying to figure out what is her role now running this department, I think is quite gorgeous. There was something quite lovely and adult about it. And at the same time, you're looking at me like it's not adult. I just want to say at the same time, the chase scenes from the beginning on, the opening racing across Istanbul, were as fun and as fine as I've ever seen.
I think there are some good chase scenes and some good moments in it. But look, the thing you really want from a James Bond movie isn't just the great stunts and all of that elaborate stuff. You want the figure of Bond himself to be this person of impeccable perfection and style and execution, whether he is playing a card game or saving the world. And there is so much adult gravitas kind of stuff in this movie that I think that Daniel Craig, he seems to be playing an interesting hero, but he doesn't really seem to be playing James Bond. He doesn't kind of get to do both at once.
But he's playing his kind of James Bond, just as each of the Bonds that we have seen have made them each man's own. I think he has made it his own character.
Well, maybe, but in Casino Royale, which I think is an infinitely better movie, he was able to have that complexity and at the same time have the total mastery of Bond, which is really what defines this character. And I think in this movie, there's too much self-doubt. There is too much kind of meaningless gravitas. I do think that it has some
gravitas.
Yeah, I do think that it has some good moments, but I especially like the first half. But as it went on, it just felt less and less like a James Bond movie. They finally end up, the big climax just takes place in this house in the middle of nowhere, and they're trying to fend off the villains. And I suddenly thought, this isn't a James Bond movie. This feels like the climax of Red Dawn or Straw Dogs or some kind of conventional thriller rather than a Bond thriller.
It is a Bond thriller because it is James Bond facing off against an essential villain. And Bardem, you've got to admit, is a pretty great villain with his blonde hair and his kind of slithery reptilian look.
I think Bardem is really good.
I felt like, maybe we're saying this again and again, but I felt Bond needs to change over the course of time. In the future, there will be other Bonds. I have no problem with that. It sounds like you want to hang on to an idea of James Bond rather than the evolution of him on film.
I think I want to see him change. I want to see him deepen, but he has to stay true to who James Bond is. And by the end of this movie, he is as much just kind of thriller guy as he is Bond. And that's why I didn't think it was a bad movie, but it didn't give me the excitement that a great Bond movie does.